G'day team, welcome back to another installment in this series on how to pass the GSSE. Now we've got some really good feedback from the first few videos and as a result of that, this particular video is going to be going through some frequently asked questions that I've received throughout the last couple of weeks. Now the questions that we'll be covering today will be: when should I sit the GSSE? What should I focus on if I had less than 6 months to study? How much study did I get through in a day? How did I study during work? And what would I do differently if I had my time again? Let's get started. One of the questions I get asked is, when should I sit the GSSE? I think the ideal time to sit the GSSE is probably in June of your first year of residency or you being a PGY2. There are a few reasons for this. First of all, you have had an entire year of being a doctor, so hopefully all of those intern worries have kind of melted away. You're hopefully a little bit confident in your abilities to manage ward calls and things, and so you don't need to focus as much on figuring out how to be a doctor, so to speak. You would have had enough time where throughout your internship where you've had minimal responsibility and kind of maximal money, so you can, splurge a little bit, have a bit of fun after you've been through med school all this time, but also transitioning from being a student back into full-time work, that can take a little bit of getting used to. So by the time you're resident, hopefully you're quite used to that. If you are doing a Diploma of Anatomy course, most of which are done in the earlier part of the year, so the first half of the year, by the time they finish, you would have been able to use those opportunities as both learning and revision for the GSSE exam, which is run in June. And finally, you're not so far out from your medical school that you would have forgotten all of your pathology and physiology, which you probably learned in your preclinical years. So you've still got that foundational knowledge which you can build on to study for the GSSE. Now, an alternative would be doing February post your internship. So you've done, again, most of the whole, your intern woes kind of melting away, you've had a bit of experience, and you use the time over summer after your internship to study for the February exam. Now in Victoria, the last 3 weeks of your contract as an intern is annual leave, and that is prime time to be studying for that exam because that will be towards the latter half of January with the GSSE exam being around early to mid-Feb. So that actually works out quite nicely, and that's another good option if you wanted to do it. However, that does mean that you will be studying over summer, so Christmas, New Year's, and of course my birthday, so you probably don't want to be doing that. What I would say is that you definitely want to aim to get the GSSE out of the way before you take on any senior positions, such as senior resident medical officers or senior residency or registrar work. So those transitioning from being a resident to having any one of those slightly more senior roles is often quite a big jump in responsibility. That means that you'll be spending possibly a lot more time at work, but also doing a lot more work for work outside of your normal working hours. And you really want to be able to do that justice. So if you can get the GSSE out of the way before you transition to those more senior roles, it's going to be in your best interest, I think. At the end of the day, you want to make sure that first and foremost, you are being a good, competent doctor. So if you are able to study for the GSSE while you have the responsibility level that you are quite comfortable with, it's going to be in your best interest. What should you focus on if you've got less than 6 months to study? So in my videos, I advocated for having around about, anywhere between a 3 to 6 month study period. My particular study period was around about 5.5 months, 22 weeks of study plan. But if you are on a bit of a tight schedule, let's say it's 3 months, maybe less than 3 months, then you really need to be picky with what you're focusing your time on. So what I would focus it on would be based on the exam structure for the GSSE. You can see that there are certain topics that have more points allocated to them. So having said that, for example, for pathology, you would be focusing on your general pathology, your tissue response to injury, infection, and neoplasia as your big core topics. So if you can master those, you're going to get hopefully the majority of the points for the pathology section. For physiology, you're going to be focusing on renal, cardiovascular, respiratory, and gastrointestinal as your big, and cardiology as your big core topics. Now, I'll make some videos on the subtopics within those that I think are going to be really high yield. So hopefully you guys can watch them and get a bit of an idea of what the questions commonly ask about and the principles of the questions commonly ask about. I think that'll be really helpful actually. When it comes to anatomy, you're going to be thinking about head and neck, upper limb, lower limb, thorax, abdo-pelvis. Now, I know that kind of sounds like the majority of the things, but the anatomy exam does account for 50% of your overall marks for the GSSE. How much study did I get through in a day? This is a really good question, and I think it's very dependent on the type of study that you're doing. So whether it be active learning or learning new material rather, whether you're revising, so going back through old content, or versus where you're just smashing out multiple choice questions. So everyone will have their own kind of rhythm. For me, like I've mentioned in previous videos, pretty much only use those summary PDFs of the bank questions as my primary source of study material. And my goal, if I was learning new material, would be to go through about 20 pages of that in any one given day. Now, that on the days where I was purely studying, so for example, a weekend day where I had that time off, then that 20 pages, I might be able to go through that pretty quickly because all I'm doing is really studying, and then I'd be able to take it easy for the rest of the day. For other days where, for example, I was at work for most of the day and didn't have as much time to study, it would be a little bit more of a stretch to get through that 20 pages. Now, 20 pages is just what I could get through in a day without feeling too fatigued. Everyone will have a different kind of threshold for when they need to stop because their study is no longer useful. It's no longer fruitful because you're just too mentally exhausted. When it came to revision, if I was going through the same PDFs but revising, then I would try and get through around about 60 pages because I've read those questions before. I don't really need to be reading the explanations unless I'm getting the questions wrong. So I can reasonably get through a lot more questions and a lot more content in that same period of time. If I was smashing out just MCQs, which I didn't really end up actually doing until probably the last 10, 11 days before the exam, I was going through around about 500 questions a day. And that was quite intense. So it would essentially be, since the time I woke up, I would start doing questions even before I've gotten out of bed, smash through 25, 50 questions before then I've kind of done 10% of the number of questions that I want to do for the day. Anytime I had some downtime, I would go through another 25 questions, and then slowly but surely I chipped away at the 500 question a day target that I had. At the end of it all, in that 11 days, ended up doing about 4,800 questions. So there were some days obviously where I didn't hit my 500 question target, and that was okay because I knew I was overshooting. Again, just to reiterate, my goals are not necessarily what your goals should be. Everyone will have their own goals. So just try and figure out at what point do I start to fatigue and my study is no longer useful, and make your goal a little bit before that. How did I study during work? Great question, because I think a lot of the study that I did ended up being at work or during working hours when I had a little bit of downtime. But you really need to be quite efficient and have a good system to be able to get into the groove of studying if you are going to be doing it kind of ad hoc. So what I would definitely recommend is have your materials online. So whether you have it in a Google Drive, whether you have it in your email, whether you have it on a website, whether you have it somewhere, it needs to be accessible. Or you could alternatively have it on a USB stick. So make sure your study material is accessible at all times. I would definitely be bringing around either your laptop or your iPad with you everywhere. Even if you, for example, are at the hospital in ICU where there's computers everywhere and you can access your things, I would always bring my laptop on the off chance that A, there wasn't a computer available, or B, I was able to use my laptop as a secondary screen for the work computer that I've got in front of me. And I found that to be really, really helpful. Obviously, it sounds a lot like common sense to have your laptop with you everywhere you go, but even if you are going for short shifts, long shifts, even if I was doing locum work or anything like that, then I would always make sure that I have some form of electronic device which can access all of my notes available to me at all times. That doesn't necessarily mean I was studying at all times. It just meant that if I was in the mood to study, if I was mentally ready to study, that I had that option available to me. And finally, you need to have a strategy, but you also need to be flexible. So for me, the majority of the time I spent studying during working hours, I would be revising, not really learning new content. But there were times that I, for example, had quite a bit of downtime during one of my shifts, and I would be able to run through new content. But if you're the type of person who really needs zero distractions in order to be able to digest new information, then learning new content is not going to be useful for you. And maybe you should just stick to multiple choice questions or revision. So try and figure out what you can reasonably do with a certain level of distraction coming in and out, and focus on having that information available to you so that you can do that at any given time. To give you an example of what studying at work looked like for me, I was on my ICU rotation after we've done our ward round and I've done all of my jobs for the day, and there's a quiescent period before the next ward round begins later on in the afternoon. I would set up my laptop. I would actually firstly go around and ask all the nursing staff within my pod whether there was anything that they needed done. I would, after I've completed all of those tasks, sit down with my laptop at a computer, load up my notes, load up my OneNote, and then start to read through all all of my old notes or new information and start to study in that sense. I'd watch some YouTube videos, bring my headphones, and I'd be able to get a reasonable amount of study done. Again, you do need to be flexible because obviously if you're on the clock, your first and foremost priority is going to be being a good doctor. So being accessible, making sure people know that they can still come to you and ask questions, that's going to be really important because you definitely don't want to be pissing anyone off while you're at work. What would I have done differently? I don't think there's too much I would have done differently from a study plan perspective because I actually found my study plan to be quite useful, which is part of the reason why I'm sharing it with everyone. But I do think my management of all my non-GSSE stuff could have been a little bit better. So I could have built in some more time into my study plan where I have downtime, like I actually have to take time out from studying. Because I think for myself, I can get quite into my own head about me not studying enough and I end up pushing myself more and more and more and more each day. So as an example, when I first started doing my question bank questions in the last kind of 11 days, my initial target was to do 200 questions a day. But once I was able to reach that with relative ease in the first couple of days, then I started bumping it up to 300, 400, 500 until I was really kind of cranking out questions. But it was actually negatively affecting me because I felt like that if I didn't hit 500 questions in a day, that I was kind of failing myself. So if you're similar to me, I think you really need to build in days where you have to take time off, or you have to spend time on yourself or with your family or with your friends to prevent yourself from burning out, because burnout is absolutely real and you will definitely either come close to it or hit it during your time studying for the GSSE if you're studying for it with relative intensity. Other things I probably could have done would be to delve a little bit more into curating playlists of either YouTube videos or podcasts that I could listen to, for example, on the way to and from work. I think that would have been a good use of time. But then again, I use those commutes to kind of clear my head for the day and just listen to music. And I found that to be good. But there were some days where I was in the car, for example, going for a longer drive, and I kind of felt like listening to music was a little bit of a waste of time for me. And I was ready in the correct mindset to be able to delve into some information. I also think I could have made an effort to reduce my decision fatigue. I think decision fatigue is definitely a real thing, and the paradox of choice is also a real thing. So if you are the type of person that gets decision fatigue easily, then maybe you can do some things to prevent that from happening, such as getting meal deliveries to prevent you from having to think about what meal prep you're going to do, or whether it be, wearing scrubs at all times during when you go to work, so you don't have to think about what clothes you're going to be wearing. Just little things like that will help to preserve some kind of mental energy, which you can later use to study, and I think that would be quite useful. And I also think that I would have really liked to have an iPad to be able to do some study, because I found a lot of the time I ended up using my phone to do some study, especially going through multiple choice questions and things. But it's just not particularly conducive. I didn't really get good study when I was using my phone. So I think buying an iPad may have been useful, but I'm still yet to buy an iPad. So I don't know, and I've fared fine. So that's probably a bit of a moot point. All right, those are some of the frequently asked questions I've gotten in the last couple of weeks since putting out the first videos. If you guys have more questions, please let me know and I'll make more videos. I am planning on doing some high yield path and phys videos going through the core concepts, which I think will be really useful for you guys, and also breaking down some anatomy questions as well. If there's specific things you guys would like to see, please let me know. Thank you.